They thought I was just another naive newcomer when the HOA stormed into my life, demanding I hand over my cabin and land, but what they didn't know was that the very ground they were standing on was mine, every inch of it, and by the time they realized I was their landlord, it was far too late. Stick with me to the end of this insane story, and if you love shocking twists like this, don't forget to hit subscribe right now. The day I moved into the old cedar cabin on the edge of the lake, I thought the biggest challenge ahead of me would be restoring the cracked porch and maybe replacing the leaky roof, but within 24 hours I realized the real storm wasn't the weather, it was the HOA, the Homeowners Association, that descended on me like vultures circling fresh meat, banging on my door with a stack of papers and self-righteous demands, telling me my firewood pile violated their aesthetic code, my driveway gravel didn't match the community standards, and worst of all, that my land technically belonged to them, and I needed to sign it over immediately if I wanted to avoid fines, liens, and even possible eviction, and I stood there smiling faintly while inside my chest my heart burned with laughter because they had no clue who I was, no clue that months before I ever set foot in that cabin, I had quietly acquired not just my property, but the entire development through a trust, making me not just a resident but the actual landlord of every smug face glaring at me from my doorstep. And while they puffed themselves up with threats and jargon, I was already plotting how to flip this ridiculous ambush into the sweetest revenge I'd ever tasted. They paraded into my yard like they owned the place, their president, a red-faced man named Carl with a gut that strained against his polo shirt, waving documents as though they were holy scripture, flanked by Linda, the treasurer with eyes that could cut glass, and a few other board members who looked like they practiced scowling in the mirror every morning. Carl launched into his speech about protecting the community's image, and how my rustic cabin lowered property values, and how their bylaws gave them the right to seize land if it wasn't up to code, and I just leaned on the doorframe, nodding politely, letting them dig themselves deeper into their own arrogance. What they didn't know was that the paperwork they waved in my face was useless, because 6 months ago, after the previous developer defaulted on their loans, I had stepped in and bought the entire subdivision at auction under an LLC that traced back to me, quietly and legally, so while they thought they were enforcing rules, they were standing on property owned by the very man they were threatening. I decided not to reveal my hand right away. Instead, I told them calmly that I'd review their concerns and get back to them, which infuriated Carl, who wanted immediate compliance, but I closed the door on their fuming faces and sat down by the fireplace, laughing so hard I nearly cried, because this was going to be fun. Over the next week, they escalated. Letters stuffed into my mailbox with threats of daily fines, neighbors whispering about me at the general store, even Linda snapping photos of my yard from her SUV parked across the street as if she were gathering evidence for a court case. But every note they sent, every citation they filed, I collected in a neat folder labeled, "Future Embarrassment." What they didn't know was that I had already scheduled a community-wide meeting, and when the day came, I sent out invitations under the HOA's own letterhead, which of course I controlled now, summoning every resident to the clubhouse for a mandatory update on ownership matters. The room buzzed with chatter as they arrived, all glaring at me as though I were the enemy, and Carl stood at the front, ready to berate me in public. When I finally stepped up, cleared my throat, and dropped the bombshell. Ladies and gentlemen, I've been patient, but it's time you know the truth. This community doesn't belong to your board, it belongs to me. I am not just your neighbor. I am your landlord. The silence that followed was the sweetest I'd ever heard, broken only by the sound of Carl's jaw practically hitting the floor, and Linda's pen clattering to the table. I pulled out the legal documents, the property deeds, the corporate filings, everything ironclad and notarized, showing that the entire development had been transferred to my company, and therefore every HOA officer now answered to me. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people were delighted, tired of the HOA's tyranny, while others panicked, realizing their petty power games had just ended. Carl sputtered about illegality and fraud, but when I handed the microphone to my attorney, who explained calmly and thoroughly that every action had been perfectly lawful, Carl turned pale, beads of sweat dripping from his temples. That's when the real fun began. Over the next month, I dismantled the HOA piece by piece, abolishing ridiculous rules about mailbox colors, tearing up fines for things like lawn height, and opening the lakefront trails the board had selfishly restricted to themselves. The residents who had once looked at me with suspicion now thanked me, shook my hand at the cafe, even brought pies to my porch, while Carl and Linda sulked in silence, stripped of authority, their little empire reduced to dust. But the story didn't end there. No, because power-hungry people rarely go down quietly. One night, I caught Carl sneaking around my property with a flashlight, snapping photos of my cabin like he was trying to build a case against me, and I stepped out onto the porch with a spotlight and a camera of my own, catching him red-handed. "Trespassing on your landlord's property," I called out. "Not a good look, Carl." He bolted like a guilty teenager, but I sent the footage to every resident the next day, and whatever shred of credibility he had left vanished overnight. Linda tried to mount a rebellion, whispering that I'd stolen the community, but when I announced at the next meeting that not only was rent staying low, but I was investing in new amenities, a renovated park, a community garden, and even free Wi-Fi around the lake, her mutiny evaporated as people cheered. Still, Carl and Linda weren't done. They tried to sue me, dragging me into court, claiming I had no right to override the law, but the judge took one look at the deeds and contracts and dismissed the case so hard it practically bounced off the walls, even warning them about filing frivolous lawsuits. By now, most residents adored me, but I knew Carl's obsession wouldn't stop until he was completely broken. So I devised the final twist. I offered him a job. Yes, I told Carl, the man who once demanded my land, that I needed a groundskeeper for the community park. The humiliation was almost too much for him, but when he realized his reputation was in tatters, his savings drained from legal fees, and nobody else wanted to hire him, he accepted. To this day, I see him mowing the grass while I sip coffee on my porch, and every time our eyes meet, I can see the bitter reminder that the land he once claimed was his is actually mine, and always will be. The irony is delicious, but the lesson is even sweeter. Never underestimate the quiet new neighbor, because you never know when he's the one holding the deed to everything you think you control. And as for me, I sit in my cabin, looking out at the lake, smiling every time I hear the hum of Carl's mower, knowing that the WA stormed into my life demanding my land, but in the end, it was I who owned theirs. And if you think that twist was wild, you'll want to stick around, because I've got plenty more stories where this one came from, and you won't want to miss the next.